The sun is going down. Soon the moon will be full. And then it's time to talk about comic books. Because it's Wednesday. Well, actually, as I'm filming this, it's Tuesday evening, but you will see it on Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I will talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. And this week, we're talking about a fantastic comic book. This, in fact, was my favorite comic book when I was a little kid. I stumbled across this comic book in the back issue bins of my local comic book shop. And I was astounded because I never knew that this comic book existed. You see, when I was a little kid, my favorite thing in the world was monsters. I loved monsters. I haven't really changed all that much, Roger, but I really loved monsters when I was a little kid. And my favorite kind of monster was werewolves. I loved werewolves. You know, I was a big fan of the old Universal horror movies. And my favorite Universal horror movie was The Wolfman. The Wolfman was my favorite. I love this movie, The Wolfman. So I was thrilled when I found out that Marvel Comics had at one time published a comic book about a werewolf. It lasted a little bit over 40 issues, and then it was canceled. But during that time, it was mostly amazing. I loved it, Werewolf by Night. I have the entire set now. I never found all of the individual issues. I found a lot of them, but I never found all of them. But now I have all of them in this gigantic omnibus. This is the magnificent Werewolf by Night omnibus. Every single magnificent issue of this fantastic comic book about a werewolf. It was about a young werewolf. His name was Jack Russell. His name was Jack Russell. Of course it was. So young Jack Russell, when he turns 18, discovered that he had been cursed. You see, his father was a warlock, dabbled in necromancy, and because of that, he was cursed. So he's a werewolf, Jack Russell. He is cursed, and every month for at least 3 nights, and sometimes 4, depending on the moon, he becomes a werewolf. And what a great comic book. It was conceived by Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas, who brought us Conan the Barbarian to Marvel Comics and wrote everything. But he had an idea to do a comic book about a young werewolf. He was kind of inspired to do a kind of Spider-Man type of thing. But instead of a young guy turning into a superhero, we had a young guy turning into a werewolf. He originally was going to title it I, Werewolf. Fortunately, he didn't title it that. There was a story that was published in Atlas Comics, which was what Marvel Comics was before there was a Marvel Comics. That was called Werewolf by Night. And so I guess he just took that title and gave it to this comic book about young Jack Russell who becomes a werewolf. Now I have this massive thing, but it's also available now in Marvel Masterworks editions that are being published. The first 2 so far have been published. There's a third on the way. It did not actually begin publication in its own magazine or its own comic book. It showed up in Marvel Spotlight, was it number 2? Marvel Spotlight number 2, which I have lurking in the back somewhere. But yeah, this is the cover to Marvel Spotlight number 2. The first appearance of the werewolf. Illustrated by the fantastic Mike Ploog. And you get a great look at Mike Ploog's werewolf here on the cover to the omnibus. Mike Ploog drew all kinds of horror comics for Marvel back in the 1970s. And the best thing that he did for the horror comics was Werewolf by Night. I mean, his werewolf was incredible. He was just such a great artist. He wasn't the type of artist that could really convincingly do superheroes, but he was perfect for horror. He was perfect for horror comics. And he had such style. It was kind of a cartoony style, but at the same time, like I said, perfect for horror. And his Werewolf was just a masterpiece. It was a masterpiece. And so in the first issue, we have this werewolf. Now, this werewolf in the first issue seems a little dog-like. He seems a little bit, appropriately enough, I guess, for Jack Russell. But the werewolf, he didn't really pin down the werewolf's look for a couple issues. But we have this first issue where Jack Russell first becomes a werewolf. And he doesn't realize at this point that he's a werewolf. He wakes up and he thinks he's just been having dreams. He doesn't know he's really a werewolf. Unfortunately, he finds out soon enough that he is, in fact, a werewolf. And here he fights an actual wolf. It was pretty great. In this first issue, Jack Russell's mother dies. And she fills him in about his actual father, who was a warlock. And because of that, he became a werewolf. And what is it? Rhonda, cut it out. Don't you see I'm trying to talk about a werewolf over here? There's a strange supernatural beast over there who's trying to interrupt me. It's an Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Give me a break. Anyway, Jack Russell's dad was a werewolf. And he passed this curse down to his unlucky son, who was transformed into a werewolf every full moon. So, every month, for 3 or maybe even 4 days, depending on the moon, he becomes a werewolf. Now, Jack Russell's werewolf in this comic book, he's dangerous. You learn right away that this monster is he's a dangerous creature. He's a pure animal. And he's just great. You did not mess with the werewolf. I mean, some people were foolish enough to mess with the werewolf, but it was always a bad idea. And these original issues illustrated by Mike Ploog are just so great. Marvel Spotlight, which up through issue number 4 of Marvel Spotlight, it had issues of the werewolf before it became its own book. And by this point, Ploog had really gotten his style down. And he really had the werewolf down it also. He really got the look for this werewolf. And the art is just moody and fantastic. He just has such a unique style, Ploog does. And these comics were just great. I mean, his werewolf was magnificent. And stumbled across every creepy, villainous person that he could in the early 70s in Los Angeles. This comic book is very of its time. Everything looks gloriously of the 1970s in this comic book. It's wonderful. It's just a wonderful piece of 1970s history. And just some of the artwork is just so glorious. Here, the werewolf is finally where he wants to be. He's always trying to search for the forest where he can be free. But then he becomes Jack Russell, and Jack Russell just goes back to the city. But yeah, it's pretty fantastic. And Mike Ploog is always best when he inks himself. But we did get some other inkers. The original stories, even though Roy Thomas came up with the idea, the original stories in the early issues were written by Jerry Conway. And he does a pretty good job, I have to say, with these initial issues. The first half of the series of Werewolf by Night was definitely better than the second half, I have to say. And like I said, the artwork was just great. We have our Jack Russell with his long sideburns from the 70s, haunted by the werewolf. And he always, he can never find a cure to his curse. And, he's just liable to turn into a werewolf at the worst times. He would lose automobiles, clothing would get shredded. He had a tough time, Jack Russell. And his biggest fear is that his sister would eventually inherit this curse as well. There's Jack Russell's sister there. And so he's always trying to prevent this fate from happening to her. Meanwhile, like I said, every supernatural creature that pops up, the werewolf has to fight it. Now, this series of comic books does take place in the Marvel Universe, but fortunately, we do not run across superheroes in Werewolf by Night until the very end, unfortunately. Here's the thing. When you have a horror comic book, like the 1970s horror comic books, I mean, when superheroes would show up in your horror comic book, it would just kind of ruin them, because it just ruined the atmosphere for the most part. There were exceptions. I mean, if Doctor Strange would show up, that was one thing. Or maybe even some of the X-Men, that was all right. But most superheroes, you don't want, like Iron Man or Thor to show up. But it's okay for these horror creatures to show up in a superhero comic book, because there's so much weird stuff in superhero comic books anyway. It's all right. And some of these panels, I remember just reading these issues over. This was an issue I read over and over and over again. And these images of the werewolf, they're just burned in my brain, because I just looked at them so often and read these comics over and over and over again. And they were great. I mean, they were just great stories. Where, Jack Russell always getting himself into trouble. Here he is, stuck in a carnival circus, as the werewolf. Which would happen in the 70s, it happened to the X-Men too, Have to watch out for those carnivals. I mean, some of the covers were just remarkable. I mean, look at that. That's Ploog. Ploog would always ink himself when he did the covers. But sometimes when other people would ink him, it wouldn't always turn out so great. Like, who's he being inked? Oh, yeah, Jim Mooney. Well, Jim Mooney's not going to do you any favors. And he certainly didn't do Mike Ploog any favors in that issue. And eventually, unfortunately, Ploog left the book. He did come back to the book for a while. And like I said, the werewolf was actually a very dangerous monster. I mean, he would just up and kill you if you got in his way. He wasn't like any kind of hero or anything like that. He would end up doing heroic things just because he was fighting monsters, other monsters that were even worse than him all the time. But yeah, he was, like I said, dangerous. Now, Jack Russell did finally meet a woman who had magical powers, who could control the werewolf, sort of, for a while. And that was helpful, but, she wasn't always around. So he ended up getting himself into trouble. And you can kind of see this in the back half of the series. There was this great story in issue 31. And you can kind of see what's going to happen in this issue, where the werewolf is out in the forest, and this little girl ends up in his path. So, he's going to eat her because he's a werewolf. Now, at this point, Don Perlin is doing the artwork. Don Perlin has never been my favorite artist. He's always been a little weird, but I actually kind of liked him on the werewolf, because his werewolf was just so creepy and so strange. His werewolf was all teeth, and they looked like really dangerous teeth, and which was appropriate. Because in this story, like I said, this little girl comes across the werewolf. And Jack Russell's best friend, Buck, shows up and has to try to stop the werewolf from killing the little girl, and just gets mauled to hell. I mean, he is just, he's just torn apart, this poor guy, as he tries to save this little girl's life from the werewolf. The werewolf who's busy at this moment killing his best friend. At least puts him in the hospital. But he just, and it's just savage, man. He just savagely tears into him and just keeps tearing into him because he's a savage monster. And I remember thinking when I read this story that it really hit home just how awful it would be to be a werewolf. You know, when you're a kid, you can kind of dream about being a kid who's also Spider-Man, but you don't want to be the werewolf. Because the werewolf, you know, he does stuff like that, where you might accidentally, you know, kill your best friend, and then the next day you wake up and you don't remember it. And then end up finding out. It was grim stuff. Also, of course, Moon Knight made his debut appearance as a Werewolf by Night villain. Moon Knight was a little bit different in those early issues. Let's see if I could find the issue with Moon Knight. Oh yeah, here's Moon Knight. There's a couple issues with Moon Knight, right? Yeah. Moon Knight fighting the werewolf. That's where Moon Knight first showed up, where it was as a villain in Werewolf by Night. But such a great character that he was brought back. Steve Donoghue will disagree with me about Moon Knight being a great character, but you know, what does he know? Werewolf by Night continued on being very strange. It just kept getting weirder and weirder and weirder. Unfortunately, it didn't have the legs that the greatest horror comic book, Tomb of Dracula, had. And so in 1977, sales were starting to fall on Werewolf by Night. I know, it's inexplicable. I don't know how that could have been. Because Werewolf, this is a great comic book, man. But, so they made some terrible changes. And we can see that this book is doomed right here. Right here where we have Iron Man showing up in your Werewolf by Night comic book. The Kiss of Death, a superhero showing up in your horror comic book. And what they do is suddenly Jack Russell has control of the werewolf by this issue. And he becomes basically in this issue, which was the end. It was the end of Werewolf by Night. He becomes a superhero, basically. Only instead of a radioactive spider or something, he's just a werewolf who works with Iron Man. It was terrible. It was a terrible way to end. Fortunately, that was not the last we heard from the Werewolf by Night. Fortunately, he did return in, you know, various places. He showed up in Moon Knight, appropriately enough, since, you know, the Moon Knight was spawned by the Werewolf by Night comic book. Werewolf by Night made a really great guest appearance in the first Moon Knight ongoing series. That was great. And he showed up here and there in other places. Like when Captain America became a werewolf for a while. Jack Russell showed up in those issues. That's a whole other thing that Steve and I will cover one day. That was interesting. But this was magnificent. It was just glorious. It was for me, it was the almost perfect Marvel horror comic book. It was my favorite. The perfect Marvel horror comic book, of course, was Tomb of Dracula. Nothing can really touch that. But Werewolf by Night was pretty great. And it had such great talent on this book. Not only did you have Jerry Conway, Marv Wolfman showed up to write some issues. The tagline was, "Finally a werewolf written by a wolfman." And Doug Mensch showed up, who did a really good job as a writer on Werewolf by Night. The artwork never really reached the heights that it did when Mike Ploog was on it. Some of the artwork wasn't so great after Mike Ploog left, but you know, it's hard to follow him. He was just so great that, you know, it's hard to follow Ploog's Werewolf because it was just fantastic. I definitely recommend this series. It's fun to read about the trials and tribulations of our werewolf, who told everything, and this was unusual at the time. He told everything in first person. This is all Jack Russell talking here, which was an interesting way at the time to write a comic book. Now you don't think anything of it. But back in the early 70s, that was unusual, to have a character narrate his own story, which Jack Russell does, and did through the entire series. It was interesting, and it was fun, and it was glorious. It's the almost perfect Marvel horror comic book. It's Werewolf by Night. You should read it. You should read it. Okay, guys, we'll catch you next time.